My name is Colleen, and I was 43 years old the day I learned that my brother had emptied our father's accounts, every last dollar, including the money Dad had set aside to bury himself 3 days before the funeral. I found out the way you find out the worst things, in the middle of an ordinary phone call. I was standing in my father's kitchen, the one I'd practically lived in for the last 3 years, still wearing the cardigan I'd slept in. And the woman from the funeral home was on the line, gentle and apologetic, the way they're trained to be. She said there seemed to be a problem with the payment for Dad's arrangements. The prepaid account, he'd set up the one he'd been so proud of, because he didn't want to be a burden to you kids, had been closed out. Drained to zero. She was so sorry to bother me at a time like this. I remember looking out the window over the sink at my father's empty bird feeders, the ones I'd kept filling out of habit even after he was gone. And I remember the strange calm that comes right before the floor drops out. Because I already knew. Before she finished the sentence, I knew exactly who had done it. And I knew exactly how he'd justify it to himself. And I knew that this particular cruelty, taking the money my father had set aside so that burying him wouldn't cost his children a thing, was somehow the most honest thing my brother had ever done. His name is Grant. And I'm going to tell you everything. Welcome to Composed Drama Stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. Because here's what my brother didn't count on, standing in his good funeral suit, certain that grief would keep me quiet, and that nobody would ever look too closely at a few transfers made in the chaos after a death. He didn't count on a quiet, semi-retired accountant named Iris, who had been doing my father's books for 30 years, and who had spent the last 2 of them watching something she couldn't quite prove and didn't have the standing to stop. He didn't count on me walking into her office and asking the one question that finally let her say the thing she'd been holding. And he had no idea, none, that the very speed of what he'd done, the greedy efficiency of it, was the thing that was going to undo him completely. He thought he was taking an inheritance early. What he was actually doing, it turned out, had a different name, and a clock attached to it, and a daughter who spends her whole working life catching the one small error everyone else waved through. He thought the money was the account that mattered. He was about to learn, in a courtroom, in front of the whole family, which account he'd actually spent his life leaving empty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back, because you can't understand the size of what my brother stole until you understand what the last 3 years actually cost. Our mother, Marie, died when I was 38. After that, it was just Dad Ray rattling around in the house on Delmar Street where we'd grown up, in a neighborhood on the south side of Louisville where everybody's father had worked with his hands. Ours certainly had. Dad was a machinist, a tool and die man, 31 years at the same plant, with forearms like cable in a garage workshop he loved more than almost anything. He could fix anything that had moving parts. He just couldn't, in the end, fix himself. It started small, the way it does. He'd forget where he parked. He'd tell me the same story about a fishing trip twice in one visit. Then one afternoon he left a pot on the stove and didn't notice the smoke, and the neighbor called me at the pharmacy. And I drove over with my heart in my throat and found him standing in a kitchen full of haze, confused about why the alarm was going off. That was the day the next chapter started. And I was the one who started it, because I was the one who was there. I'm a pharmacist. I've spent 20 years behind a counter being the last line of defense between a tired doctor's handwriting and somebody's grandmother, catching the interaction that would have put a person in the hospital, explaining the same instructions 4 different ways until I'm sure they've landed. It is unglamorous, careful, invisible work, and I am good at it precisely because I notice things other people gloss over. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters later. When Dad started slipping, I did what I do. I noticed. I organized. I moved his medications into a system he could follow, and then, when he couldn't follow any system, I moved myself. I started staying over. Then, I was there most nights. Then I gave up my own apartment and the last shreds of my own life, and I moved into my childhood bedroom at 41 years old, so that my father could stay in his home with his bird feeders and his workshop and his dignity for as long as humanly possible. I'm not telling you this for a medal. I'm telling you so you understand the shape of it. For 3 years, I did the things nobody photographs. I learned to give a man his pills crushed into applesauce when he forgot how to swallow them. I sat up with him through the nights when the confusion turned to fear, and he didn't know where he was, or, sometimes, who I was. There were nights he called me Marie, and I learned to just be Marie for him, because correcting him only frightened him more. And what's a name between the people who love you? I drove him to cardiology and neurology and the dentist. I paid the electric bill and the water bill, and bought the groceries, and cooked the soft foods, and did the laundry that comes with a failing body. And I did it on a pharmacist's salary while quietly draining my own savings, because that's what you do. And my brother Grant called on Sundays. Let me give you a few of those nights, so the word caregiving stops being abstract. Because people throw it around like it's a category on a tax form instead of the hardest thing a human being can do. There was the winter he got pneumonia, and I sat in the emergency room from midnight to dawn, translating between the night doctor and my frightened father, who kept trying to pull the IV out because he didn't understand where he was. I knew his medication list by heart, every dose, every allergy, and I caught a resident about to give him something that would have tanked his blood pressure, and the nurse looked at me differently after that. And I thought, that's the only thanks this job ever gives you, the absence of the disaster you prevented. There was the spring he started wandering, and I lay awake listening for the front door. And twice I found him in the yard at 3 a.m. in his undershirt, looking for his own father, who'd been dead for 40 years. I'd walk him back inside and make him cocoa and sit with him until the fear passed, and then I'd shower and put on my work clothes and go count out other people's pills with a smile. There was the slow, grinding humiliation that disease visits on a proud man, the parts nobody warns you about. The parts I will not describe in detail, except to say that I cleaned my father and kept his dignity intact, and never once let him see on my face that it cost me anything. Because he had wiped me as a baby, and a man should not have to feel ashamed in front of his child at the end. There were the good hours, too. I want to be fair to those 3 years. Afternoons when he was lucid and we'd sit in the workshop and he'd show me, again, how to read a micrometer. His hands steadier with a tool than with a fork. The nights he called me Marie and held my hand and told my mother he was sorry for something I never learned the shape of. And I let him say it, because some apologies need a body to land on, and I had a body and she didn't anymore. And it cost me, materially, in ways I didn't let myself count until later. I let a relationship quietly end, because I had nothing left to give a man at the end of those days. I missed friends' weddings and my own annual reviews and the small forward motion of an ordinary life. I spent my savings not on anything you could point to, just the steady bleed of 2 households on one salary, the co-pays, the supplies, the ramp I had built for the front steps, the aide I hired for the 8 daytime hours I had to be at the pharmacy. By the end, I had almost nothing in the bank, because I had poured it, like everything else, into keeping my father home. And my brother Grant called on Sundays. Briefly, he'd ask how Dad was, and I'd say the true hard things, and he'd say that's rough, call, and you're a saint. You know that? And I used to hate that word, saint, because I understood eventually what it really meant in his mouth. It meant this is your job, and not mine. It meant I've decided you're built for this, so I don't have to be. Calling me a saint was how he excused himself from the room. I want to be fair to him, so let me tell you what Grant is. Grant is charming. Grant is the firstborn. The golden one. The one with the good handshake and the easy laugh, and the regional sales job 2 states away that he always described as more important and more demanding than it was. Grant drove a leased German car and wore a watch that cost more than my month of rent, and had a way of walking into our father's house twice a year, at Christmas and on Dad's birthday, and absolutely filling it telling stories, making Dad laugh, being the event, and then leaving. And my father, God rest him, lit up for Grant in a way he never quite did for me. I made his life possible. Grant made it exciting. In the economy of our family, exciting always traded higher. It had always been that way, as far back as I can remember. Grant was 3 years older and golden from birth, good at sports, good at talking, the kind of boy teachers forgave things. When he made the high school baseball team, Dad rearranged his shifts at the plant to make the games. I don't think he ever rearranged anything for me. Not because he didn't love me, but because I was the one who didn't need rearranging for. The one who got the good grades quietly, and never caused trouble, and could be counted on, which is its own kind of curse. When Grant wrecked his first car, Dad covered it, and called it growing pains. When Grant dropped out of his second college, Dad called it finding his path. Grant's failures were always charming detours. My steadiness was always just the weather, unremarked. I learned, the way the dependable child always learns, that love came to Grant like rain, and came to me like a paycheck earned, conditional, in exchange for being useful and easy. I didn't resent it as a kid. You don't, when it's all you know. You just quietly conclude that your job in the family is to be the reliable one, and you get so good at the job that you forget it was ever supposed to come with anything in return. So when Dad, years later, sat down to organize his affairs and made Grant, who had never balanced a checkbook in his life, his financial power of attorney, nobody blinked, least of all me. Of course the money went to the son. The son was the important one. The daughter would handle the rest, the way the daughter always handled the rest. I have thought a great deal since about how that one unremarkable decision, made out of an old man's lifelong habit of overvaluing his son, became the loaded gun that went off the morning my father died. There's a thing that happens to the dependable child, and if you are one, you already know it. You become furniture. You become the given. The one who shows up is the one whose showing up stops being seen, precisely because it never stops. Grant's twice-a-year visits were treasured because they were rare. My 3 years were invisible because they were constant. And here is the part that still catches in my throat. Years earlier, when Dad first set up his affairs, he made Grant his financial power of attorney. The money, Dad figured, should be handled by the son who was good with money. Never mind that Grant's idea of being good with money was spending it. I got the daily reality of our father's decline. Grant got the keys to the bank. Nobody, including me, thought twice about it at the time. That decision would end up being the whole story. Let me explain what a power of attorney actually is, in plain terms, because it sits at the center of everything that happened. When you give someone financial power of attorney, you're handing them the legal ability to act for you with your money, to sign checks, move funds, pay bills while you're alive, but unable to manage things yourself. It's a tool of enormous trust. And it has one feature that my brother either forgot or assumed nobody would ever check. A power of attorney dies the instant the person who granted it dies. The very second my father stopped breathing, Grant's authority over his money evaporated completely. From that moment on, the only person allowed to touch Dad's accounts was the executor of his estate, acting under the supervision of a court. Remember that. My brother didn't. Dad died on a Tuesday morning in March, at home, in his own bed, with my hand in his. I'd like to tell you Grant was there. Grant was on a flight, having been called the night before when the hospice nurse told us it was close, and he landed about 4 hours after it was over. I don't hold the timing against him. You can't control a flight. I hold against him what he did with those 4 hours and the days after. Because while I was sitting with our father's body, waiting for the funeral home, making the phone calls you make, moving through that first terrible fog, my brother was on his phone. Not arranging the service, not calling relatives. He was logging into accounts. And over the next 72 hours, while I planned a funeral and chose a casket and wrote an obituary and accepted casseroles from neighbors, Grant quietly, methodically, moved every liquid dollar our father had out of Dad's accounts and into his own. The checking, the savings, the small CD Dad had been so proud of, and the prepaid funeral account, the one labeled in Dad's own careful block printing, "For my arrangements, do not touch." He touched it. He took it all. Roughly $230,000, the entire modest result of a working man's lifetime of careful living, gone before I'd even finalized the flowers. When I called him, after the funeral home called me, and I made myself wait, made myself breathe, made myself not scream, he didn't even bother to deny it. That's the thing about Grant. The charm runs out fast when he thinks he's already won. He said, in that smooth, reasonable voice, that he'd consolidated Dad's assets to simplify the estate, that it was cleaner this way, that as the financial POA, it was his responsibility to manage things, and that we'd sort out the details later. He said I was emotional and grieving and not thinking clearly, and that I should let him, the responsible one, handle the money the way Dad had always wanted. He told me to focus on the funeral he had just defunded. I remember the silence on the line after he said it, and I remember choosing, in that silence, not to react. Every cell in my body wanted to tell him exactly what he was, but I'd spent 20 years learning that the moment you raise your voice in a pharmacy, you lose. The frightened person stops listening, the angry person digs in, and the truth gets buried under the noise. So I'd trained the reflex out of myself a long time ago. I said, "Okay, Grant, we'll talk." And I hung up. And I think that okay was the most frightening thing I could have said if he'd been paying attention. Because it wasn't surrender. It was a pharmacist setting down a prescription that doesn't add up and quietly deciding to check it herself before anyone gets hurt. I hung up the phone, and I stood in that kitchen, and I felt something I had never felt in my life. Not in 3 years of bedpans and broken nights and being called by my dead mother's name. I felt the specific, clarifying fury of a person who has given everything and watched someone who gave nothing arrive at the end to loot the body. And then, and this is the part I'm proud of, this is the part my mother would have been proud of, I did not call him back to scream. I did not post about it. I did not corner him at the funeral, which is exactly what he expected, and exactly what would have let everyone write me off as the hysterical sister, making a scene over money at our father's grave. Instead, I got very quiet and very careful, and I started to do the thing I do best. I started to notice. I paid for the funeral myself. I want to say that plainly, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. I emptied what was left of my own savings. The savings 3 years of caregiving had already gutted, and I buried my father with the dignity he'd planned and paid for, and that his son had stolen. I wrote the obituary at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, the way I'd done everything for 3 years, alone, in the quiet. I chose the readings. I called the relatives. I picked the casket from a catalog with shaking hands and quietly selected one a step down from what Dad had pre-chosen. Because that was what I could afford now, and I have never told anyone that, until right now, that my brother's theft meant I buried our father in a slightly cheaper box, and hoped Dad, wherever he was, understood the neighbors brought casseroles I couldn't eat. Mr. Patel from 2 doors down, whose driveway my father had shoveled for 15 years, pressed an envelope of cash into my hand at the door and wouldn't take it back. And I sat on the stairs after he left and cried harder over that envelope than over almost anything. Because kindness from a near stranger lands differently when your own blood is robbing you. And then there was the funeral itself. I stood at that graveside in the Kentucky rain next to Grant in his beautiful charcoal suit, and I watched him work the crowd the firm handshakes, the brave catch in his voice during his little impromptu remarks about what a great man our father was. The way he gripped my shoulder for the benefit of the cousins and murmured, "We'll get through this together," call. The performance of a son. He was magnificent at it. People came up to him to say how strong he was being. A few came to me to ask if I was holding up, in the tone you use with someone slightly fragile. I let all of it happen. I let him squeeze my shoulder and play the grieving firstborn for the relatives, and I said nothing. Let him think it worked. Let him think grief and decency would keep me quiet, the way they'd kept me quiet my whole life. I had already decided what I was going to do. I just wasn't going to do it in the rain, over the grave, the way he'd have loved the hysterical sister, proving his story for him. No, I was going to do it slowly, and correctly, in rooms where charm doesn't work. Then, the Monday after we buried Dad, I called Iris Brandt. Iris had done my father's taxes and bookkeeping for 30 years. She was somewhere in her late 60s by then, mostly retired, working with a handful of old clients, out of a small office above a hardware store, the kind of accountant a working man like my dad trusts, because she's plain and sharp and doesn't bill you for hello. Dad had introduced me to her years earlier, and I'd handled some of his routine paperwork with her as he declined. I called her, I think, mostly just to ask a practical question. How does the estate work now? What do I do? Who's allowed to do what? Because I genuinely didn't know. And because some instinct told me to start with the one person who'd actually seen my father's money over the long haul. I drove to her office that afternoon. And I want to tell you about that conversation carefully, because the title of everything that happened to my family afterward could be those 20 minutes in a cramped office that smelled like old paper and coffee. You have to understand who Iris was to my father. For 30 years, she'd done his taxes every February, and every February he'd come home and report, with the satisfaction of a man who trusted exactly 3 people in the world, that Iris says were square. She'd watched his small fortune accumulate one frugal year at a time. The man clipped coupons and drove the same truck for 19 years, and was quietly, stubbornly careful. The way the Depression raised children of depression raised parents are careful. She knew his money the way I knew his medications. Intimately, professionally, with the particular tenderness of someone whose job is to protect a person from harm they can't see coming. Her office hadn't changed in 2 decades, the same green-shaded lamp, the same filing cabinets, a framed photo of her late husband, a calendar from the hardware store downstairs. She made me a cup of bad coffee and asked, first, how I was holding up, and meant it. And I realized she was grieving him too, in her own contained way. I told her the accounts were empty. I told her what Grant had said about consolidating. I asked her, plainly, whether that was allowed, whether the financial POA gave him the right to move everything into his own name like that. And Iris went very still. She took her glasses off, and she folded them, and she set them on the desk. And she looked at me for a long moment, like a woman deciding whether to finally put down something heavy she'd been carrying. And then she spoke up. She said, "Colleen, I need you to listen to me carefully, because this is important. A power of attorney ends at death. The moment your father passed, Grant had no authority over a single penny of that money. None. If he moved those funds after your father died, then he didn't manage the estate. There is no version of that which is legal. That's not a family disagreement to sort out later. That's conversion. That's potentially theft from an estate, and the law takes it very seriously." I felt the floor shift under me, but not the way it had in the kitchen. This time, it shifted toward something solid. And then Iris told me the second thing. The thing she'd been holding for 2 years. She said, "And I have to be honest with you, because your father trusted me and I should have found a way to say this sooner. For the last couple of years, while your dad was declining, I saw things in those accounts that worried me. Withdrawals that didn't match his patterns, transfers I couldn't explain, money leaving that account in ways your father, the Ray I did taxes for 3 decades, would never have done. I raised it with Grant once, gently, because he was the POA and he controlled access to your dad, and he told me your father had authorized it and that it wasn't my concern. And I had no standing. Your father couldn't tell me himself anymore, and Grant held the legal authority, and I was just the accountant. So I documented what I saw, and I kept it, and I prayed somebody would eventually come and ask me the right question. You just did. She had been waiting. Not to rescue me, Iris couldn't have done a thing on her own, and she knew it. She'd needed someone with the standing and the will to act. Someone who'd walk into her office and ask. For 2 years, that person didn't exist, because the only people who could have asked were a dying man and a son who was robbing him. And then his daughter showed up, the invisible one, the furniture, and asked the right question. And the holding came undone. I drove home that evening, and for the first time since the funeral home called, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I felt like a pharmacist again, like a person standing in front of a dangerous error that everyone else had waved through, holding the one piece of information that changes everything, with a clear and quiet duty to act. So, I acted. Here is the thing about grief. It makes you want to avoid conflict. Everyone around me, the well-meaning aunts and cousins, kept saying the same things. He's your brother. Don't tear the family apart. Your father wouldn't want you fighting over money. Let it go, for your own peace. And I understood the impulse. I'd spent my whole life keeping the peace, being the easy one, swallowing the unfairness so nobody had to feel uncomfortable. But standing in my father's kitchen, I finally understood something that took me 43 years to learn. Sometimes honoring the person you lost requires you to refuse the easy silence. My father spent 31 years making things to exact tolerances, because he believed that close enough was a kind of lie. Letting his son walk away with his life's work, with the very money he'd set aside to spare us that would have been close enough. And close enough was an insult to the man I'd buried. So I found an estate attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Delgado, who'd handled probate fights for 20 years and listened to my story with the flat, focused attention of someone who'd seen it 100 times and still found this version galling. Let me explain what we set in motion, in plain terms. Because the machinery matters, and it's the opposite of dramatic, which is exactly why it worked. When someone dies, their estate goes through a process called probate the court-supervised settling of a dead person's affairs. Someone is appointed executor, the person legally responsible for gathering the assets, paying the debts, and distributing what's left according to the will. The executor owes what's called a fiduciary duty, which is a fancy way of saying they are legally bound to act in the honest interest of the estate and its heirs, not themselves. Grant had assumed he'd be executor, because Grant assumed he'd run everything, the way he assumed everything. But here was the first crack. My father's actual will, which Iris had a copy of, and which Grant clearly hadn't read carefully, named me and Grant as co-executors. Not Grant alone. Me, the furniture. Which meant I had legal standing, full standing, to demand a complete accounting of every dollar in that estate. And the law, it turns out, does not care how charming you are. Grant found out I'd hired a lawyer within about a week, and the transformation was something to see. The smooth, reasonable voice from the kitchen phone call curdled fast. First came the wounded version, a long voicemail about how he couldn't believe I was doing this to the family. How Dad would be heartbroken to see us fighting. How he'd only been trying to protect the estate from being tied up, and I was twisting it into something ugly. When that didn't move me, he tried the other channel he worked the relatives. Suddenly the aunts who'd told me to let it go were calling with a new urgency, relaying Grant's framing, that I was grief-stricken and litigious, that I'd always resented him, that I was going to spend the whole estate on lawyers out of spite. He was good. He'd had 46 years of practice being believed, and I'd had 43 years of being the one who absorbed things quietly, so the family's muscle memory ran his direction. Then he came to the house. Showed up unannounced one evening while I was sorting Dad's medications to return them, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, our father's kitchen, and tried. In order, charm, then logic, then a settlement, then a threat. He suggested we keep it in the family and split things fairly, by which he meant I'd drop the legal action and accept whatever number he decided was generous. When I said no quietly, he told me I had no idea what I was starting, that lawyers would eat the whole estate, that I'd lose and look insane and ruin Christmas for the next 20 years. He used the word saint again, except this time it had teeth. You've always had to be the saint, haven't you? Call, the martyr, and now you finally get to punish me for having a life. I stood at the counter with my father's pill organizer in my hand, and I felt, for 1 second, the old pull to apologize, to smooth it over, to be the easy one. And then I thought about a withdrawal at 9:18 in the morning, and I said, "You should go now, Grant." And he went. That was the last conversation we ever had that wasn't through lawyers. I tell you all of that because I don't want you to picture this as clean. It was not clean. There were nights I doubted myself. Nights the family's disapproval sat on my chest like a stone. Nights I wondered if my father really would have wanted this. If I was honoring him or just feeding my own anger. Grief and conflict at the same time is a particular kind of exhausting. But every time I wavered, I came back to the same flat, immovable fact, the one that didn't care about anyone's feelings, including mine. We filed a petition with the probate court. We requested a full accounting. And critically, we requested the bank records, not the summaries, the actual transaction records, with the timestamps. Because Iris had taught me the one fact that Grant, in his arrogant hurry, had never considered the exact moment of each transfer was recorded, down to the date and time, and my father's time of death was on a death certificate signed by a hospice physician, also down to the date and time. I will never forget sitting in Delgado's office when the records came back, laying my father's death certificate next to my brother's withdrawals. Dad died at 7:52 on a Tuesday morning. The first transfer out of his accounts, the one that started the draining, the funeral money was logged at 9:18 that same morning. An hour and 26 minutes after our father stopped breathing. While I was still sitting beside his body, my brother had moved money out of a dead man's account, using the authority of a dead man, an authority that had ceased to exist at 7:52, and he had done it so fast, so confident that no one would ever look, that the bank's own clock had written his guilt in a language no charm could talk its way out of. He didn't need to confess. The timeline confessed for him. I want to be honest about how long all of this took, because the satisfying version skips it, and the skipping is a lie. This was not a week. Probate moves at the speed of a glacier with a backlog. From the morning the funeral home called me to the day the court finally ruled was the better part of a year of motions and continuances and waiting on records. A year of doing the most painful legal fight of my life, while also doing the ordinary, bottomless work of grief. I went back to the pharmacy after my bereavement days ran out and counted pills with a smile, while my chest felt full of wet sand. I came home to a house that still smelled like him and slept in my childhood bed and woke at 3 a.m. Out of 3 years of habit, listening for a father who wasn't wandering anymore because he was gone. I learned that you can be devastated and furious and methodical all at the same time, that grief and resolve are not opposites, that you can cry in the car in the courthouse parking lot and then walk in and sit up straight and say yes, Your Honor, in a clear voice. Nobody saw most of that. Nobody photographs the dependable one doing the hard thing alone. It's the whole pattern of my life in one sentence. But I kept going, motion by motion, month by month, because the alternative was letting close enough win. And I had buried a man who spent his life refusing close enough. Now I want to tell you how it actually ended, because it didn't end with me triumphantly dumping papers on a table in front of the family while Grant crumbled. Real justice is quieter and more grinding than that, and honestly more satisfying. It ended in a courtroom and a lawyer's conference room, with documents and a calendar and a judge. And it ended because the facts were simply, immovably true, and my brother, for the first time in his gilded life, was somewhere his handshake couldn't reach. Delgado petitioned the court to remove Grant from any role in the estate and to compel the return of the funds. We laid out the post-death transfer, that 9/18 timestamp, against the 7:52 death, and we put Iris on the record. She came in her good cardigan with 2 years of documentation, the worried notes she'd kept on transfers that didn't add up, and she spoke, plainly and devastatingly, about a pattern of money leaving a declining man's accounts in ways that man would never have authorized. She did not rage. Accountants don't rage. She just laid down fact after quiet fact, the way my father used to measure a part. And there was no charm in the world that could recut numbers that didn't fit. I watched my brother's face during Iris's testimony, and I want to describe it because it's the closest thing to justice I got in that room, and it was quieter than I expected. He wasn't ashamed. I don't think Grant is built for shame. He was afraid. For the first time in his life, he was in a room where his particular magic didn't work, where the warm laugh and the good suit and the firm handshake counted for exactly nothing, where the only thing that mattered was a sequence of numbers and times that he could not talk his way around. He kept glancing at his lawyer the way a man checks a parachute that isn't opening. Grant's lawyer tried. At first, the thing I'd known he'd try the reasonable man story, the grieving family story, the consolidating assets story. But you cannot consolidate assets under an authority you no longer have. And you cannot explain why managing the estate required the money to land in your personal account 90 minutes after your father died, and before anyone had even been to the funeral home. The judge, a woman who had clearly seen every flavor of this, asked Grant's attorney exactly one question about that timestamp, and the answer was a long, expensive silence. Grant was removed as co-executor. The court ordered the return of every dollar he had taken, all 230,000 of it, and because the prior pattern Iris documented suggested he'd been helping himself during Dad's decline as well, that became its own reckoning, a separate accounting he had to answer for, with the very real shadow of criminal referral hanging over the whole thing. He hired a more expensive lawyer. He settled rather than face a jury, because men like Grant always fold the instant the audience can't be charmed. He paid it back. All of it, plus the legal fees, plus the funeral he'd stolen, every cent of which I'd covered, returned to me with interest by order of a court. And the family that had told me to let it go for the sake of peace? They got very quiet. Because it's a remarkable thing, watching the favored child stand in a courtroom while a 68-year-old accountant reads the timeline of his greed into the record. You cannot unsee it. The aunts who'd squeezed my hand and called me emotional did not, I noticed, call Grant emotional. They just stopped calling him the responsible one. The story our family had told about its two children, the impressive son and the dependable daughter, got quietly, permanently rewritten. Not by me, but by a bank's clock. Some of them apologized. Later, in small, awkward ways, a card, a phone call, a "we should have listened." I took the apologies for what they were worth, which was something, but not as much as showing up would have been worth at the time. I've learned the difference between people who stand with you in the rain and people who tell you afterward they always knew it was raining. I became the sole executor. I settled my father's estate the way he settled a job, to exact tolerances, every debt paid, every dollar accounted for, and I made sure his headstone was the one he would have chosen, paid for out of his own money, the way he'd intended, the money I'd fought to bring home to him. There's a particular peace in that I didn't expect in doing the boring, honest, careful work of closing out a life correctly, after watching someone try to do it greedily and fast. I think it was the last thing I could still do for him, and I did it the way he'd have done it for me. I kept his house for a while. I kept his workshop exactly as it was for almost a year, the coffee can of bolts sorted by size, the way only he understood, the pegboard with the outline of each tool painted behind it so you always knew where things belonged, the smell of cutting oil that I swear is still in the walls. On the bench was a half-finished birdhouse he'd been building for the backyard when his hands stopped being able to hold the work steady, a real one, with a copper roof he'd cut himself because my father didn't do anything halfway. I finished it. It took me a month of evenings and a lot of cursing, and one call to Mr. Patel to borrow a clamp, and it is not as clean as Dad would have made it. But it is finished, and it is square, and it would pass. It's the only thing of his I really wanted. It hangs outside my own window now, and the birds found it within a week. And some mornings I drink my coffee and watch them come and go, and I talk to him a little. I tell him the accounts are settled. I tell him I'm sorry about the casket. I tell him I caught it, the thing he never got to see, and that the bank wrote down the time. Grant and I do not speak. I made my peace with that, too. He paid back the money, but he never once said he was sorry, not to me, not to the memory of our father, not to anyone. Some accounts, once they're emptied a certain way, don't get reopened. I don't hate him anymore, which surprises me. Mostly I feel the flat, clear pity you feel for a man who arrived at the most important moment of his family's life, with nothing in his hands, and reached, by reflex, for the only thing he'd ever learned to value. Iris and I still have coffee every few weeks in that office above the hardware store. I think we both needed it after two women who had each, in our own way, protected my father from harm he couldn't see, and who were the only two people left who had really known the careful, frugal, stubborn man underneath the decline. She told me once, stirring her bad coffee, that she'd carried those 2 years of worry like a stone, that she'd lain awake some nights knowing something was wrong with Ray's accounts and feeling powerless to do a thing about it, and that the day I walked in and asked was the day she finally got to set the stone down. I just needed someone with the right to ask, she said. You gave me that. I've thought about that a lot, how she couldn't act alone, and I couldn't have known without her, and how the whole thing only worked because I went looking and she was ready to tell. The truth needed both of us. It usually does. Here is what I learned, and I'll give it to you the way I wish someone had given it to me at the start of those 3 years, when I was crushing pills into applesauce at 2 a.m. and feeling invisible. There are 2 kinds of accounts in a family. There's the one with the money in it, and everyone can see that one, and people like my brother spend their whole lives watching it, calculating, waiting for their moment to reach in. And then there's the other account, the one you fill, slowly, one ordinary, unwitnessed deposit at a time. Every night you sit up. Every bill you quietly pay. Every time you answer to your dead mother's name because it comforts a frightened old man. Nobody photographs that account. Nobody throws you a party for it. For my whole life, I thought it didn't count for anything, because my father's face lit up brighter for 2 visits a year than it ever did for my 3 years. But I was wrong. And it took burying him to understand why. My brother emptied the account everyone could see. He took every dollar, and for about 72 hours he probably felt like he'd won. But the account that actually mattered, the one made of presence, of showing up, of being the hand somebody holds when they leave this world, that account, Grant had left empty his entire life. He'd never made a single deposit. And when our father was dying and afraid in the dark, it wasn't the financial power of attorney that mattered. It was who was in the room. That was the real inheritance. And it could not be wired anywhere. And my brother was, in the only way that counts, completely bankrupt. And here's the part that took me longest to forgive myself for not knowing sooner. I had spent 43 years believing that my account didn't count, because no one was making deposits back into it. Because love came to me like a paycheck, and I decided that meant it was worth less. But the account you fill by showing up isn't measured by what comes back. It never was. Its value isn't in being repaid. Its value is that it's real. That it actually held a frightened old man through the worst nights of his life, that when it mattered most, there was something in it, and someone there to spend it. My father couldn't see that, at the end, any more than he could see it when I was a kid, getting the good grades nobody rearranged a shift for. But it was the truest thing either of his children ever did, and only one of us did it. So if you are the dependable one, the invisible one, the furniture, if you are pouring yourself into work that no one sees and starting to believe it doesn't count because no one claps, I need you to hear this. It counts. It is the only thing that finally counts. The people who show up to loot at the end are showing you exactly what they are. And the law and time and a quiet woman with 30 years of records have a way of catching up to them. Keep showing up. Fill the account that matters. And when the moment comes that someone tries to tell you your years of quiet love were worth less than their loud arrival, refuse the easy silence. Honor your person by insisting on the truth. Close enough is a kind of lie, and the ones we lose deserve better than close enough. My father taught me that, standing at a lathe, long before I understood it. I'm grateful I got to prove I'd learned it before they lowered him into the ground. If this story reached something in you tonight, if you've ever been the one who showed up while someone else took the credit, or the spoils, please share it with somebody who needs to hear that their quiet work counts. Drop a comment and tell me about the account you've been filling that nobody sees. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.